everyone, Alexa Donne here, and today I am finally answering the question that has been answered many times in the comments that I probably should have addressed far earlier on this channel, and that is, what is YA? I think that I've gotten to the point where, like, I know what YA is, I write it, I read it almost exclusively, and I forget that it is not always completely obvious what YA is. And I actually think a huge part of the reason for that is that a lot of people don't know what YA is. They're wrong about what YA is, but they love to tell other people what YA is. Like, one of my favorites is Harry Potter's a YA series. It is not. It is not a YA series. Oh, you know, what's another good one? Oh, The Book Thief, that's YA. That is not YA. We'll talk about kind of the exceptions of what is and isn't YA, but first, let's actually define YA. So first of all, it's important to know that YA is essentially a marketing category. The reason this is important to know is it's very often mistakenly called a genre. I actually mistakenly call it a genre all the time, and sometimes that's just because it is kind of shorthand. It's easier to say YA as a genre, and YA does certainly have characteristics of it's a genre. It has a lot of defining characteristics. However, the reason we call it a marketing category rather than a genre is there are all of the stock subgenres, you know, genres of fiction that also fall under YA, because you'll have YA fantasy, YA contemporary, YA sci-fi, YA mystery, and so on. And so thus, YA is a marketing category, and there are subgenres under YA. A marketing category being, it is a way that publishers define a subset of books based on their audience, i.e. who they are marketing those books to. So it's the section of the bookstore where those books live, and it's how they market those books to a specific audience. And for this reason, YA in many ways can evolve and has evolved, though there are hallmarks of YA that I don't think will ever really change. So your rule of thumb in terms of what is YA, the big one is the age of the protagonists. YA fiction is about teenage characters, young adults. Your rule of thumb is going to be that your characters are 15 to 18 years old. Occasionally, there are exceptions where you might have a 19-year-old protagonist on the high end, occasionally 20 if a publisher is being very generous, and again, because it's a marketing category, occasionally they will decide we're gonna market this as YA, even if by the stringent definition it isn't. I can think of a few series where I definitely don't think they're YA, but alas, they were marketed as such. But I digress. On the lower end, you might sometimes see some 14-year-olds, but very rarely. And in fact, 15 is also a pretty rare age for YA. There's a reason for this. So 13 to 14, or 13 to 15 more generously, is considered kind of a no man's land of protagonist ages because it's the gap between middle grade and young adult as categories, and this is because of the readers. So readers tend to read up when they are younger. So a reader who is 9 doesn't want to read about 9-year-olds, they want to read about 11 and 12-year-olds. A reader who is 12 typically doesn't actually want to read about 13 or 14-year-olds, they actually want to start reading about 15, 16, 17-year-olds, because they're in that transition between, you know, that awkwardness of puberty hitting in middle school and high school. And honestly, I think middle school is just really heinous that when you're in middle school, you don't want to read about middle school. You want to look ahead to the promised land of high school. So younger readers, so 9, 10, and 11-year-olds might read about middle school, but a 12, 13-year-old will not. They're going to jump to YA. So you've got this awkward space between middle grade and YA. So YA is defined by the age of the characters in the actual story, though also sometimes by the audience, but as we all know, a lot of adults read young adult fiction. So this is where kind of everything gets nebulous when it comes to it being a marketing category. YA is technically and always will be for actual young adult readers about young adult characters, but of course a lot of adults read YA. And that's kind of a YA 201 video, if you will, that I might do at some point about how adult readership of YA, I think, has really stretched YA as a category in good ways and bad ways. I'll give you a snippet. I have noticed that books that would have been considered YA about 10 years ago that we might call kind of light YA are not considered YA now. You would not be able to sell a book like Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants as a YA novel right now. That would be sold as an upper middle grade novel. Just really interesting distinctions. But I digress. So back to the defining characteristics of YA. So age of the protagonist. The other, what I would call the hallmark of young adult fiction, and why I believe it is so popular with a lot of people, is there is an immediacy to young adult fiction. It's why so often YA is told in first person, though not always, but even when it's not told in first person, there is an immediacy to the perspective and the writing. You feel like you are there with the characters, and you were going on a journey with those characters. Most YA novels are coming of age novels, but not all coming of age novels are YA novels. Are you confused yet? In YA, as I'm sure you won't be surprised, it's so often about feelings. I think of YA as big emotions, big feelings, and this is because teenagers have big emotions and big feelings. You hit puberty and you've got hormones and your brain is still developing and everything is big and immediate. Everything feels like a big deal, and so you get that kind of oversized sense of feeling and conflict and stakes in YA novels. I think that's why they're so engaging for a lot of people, because everything's a big deal, because honestly, y'all remember, or you're there right now, everything was a super huge freaking big deal when you were a teenager. Even if looking back as an adult, you're like, why did that even matter? But that's not the point. It matters when you're in it. And so I think you get kind of that not larger than life feeling out of good YA and the immediacy. It also tends to be really fast-paced, both, technically in terms of the books are paced very quickly, but also the time in which the stories take place. YA tends to take place over a pretty short period of time most of the time. It's a few days, it's a few weeks, it's a few months, it's a single year at most. A couple books can get away with slightly longer timelines, but typically they're actually really short if you look at some of your favorite YA titles. And when we get into kind of the contrast between what is YA versus what isn't YA, and I'm gonna go into details, but spoiler, kind of preview with a lot of adult stories that might have parts of the book that include young adult characters and have a glimpse of teenage life, they tend to cover a much larger span of time. So if you have a book that starts when a character is 12 and it ends when they're 25, that is not a young adult novel, because it's not specifically and exclusively about the time when someone is a young adult, a teenager. Back to kind of the emotions, this is also why you see hallmarks in YA of characters who make rash decisions, or you might also hear it derisively called stupid YA heroine syndrome. And while I don't like stupid YA heroines, meaning I don't like it when characters make really illogical decisions or completely unreasonable decisions, I think there should at least be internal logic or common sense logic. Generally, young adults aren't the world's best decision makers, and I say that with love, and I say that as a former young adult who made a lot of stupid decisions. And so you're gonna have a lot of rash decisions that happen in YA, and this of course leads to delicious conflict and stakes, which can make the pages turn even faster. But also, I think that when you're a young adult, and thus in YA fiction, you're more reactive when you are in that age frame of mind, when your brain is what your brain is when you're a young adult. Whereas when you're older, it's a lot easier to be reflective. When I'm working with people and critiquing books and the tone and the voice feel off, or something doesn't feel YA enough, very, very often I have to point out that the characters are rationalizing things and making decisions the way that we do as an adult. And so often the writer is, of course, an adult. And it's not that teenagers are hot messes. They're not. They're not stupid. They're not irrational as a rule. There's just heightened emotions and sometimes faulty decision making. And so you have to kind of consider how you're writing your character and the actual decisions that they're making and how their emotions are reading on the page. Related to that, YA novels are really voicey, and they're voicey in this specific way that the characters sound like teenagers. That's just a huge hallmark of YA fiction. The thing is, you can't really teach it. I can't tell you how to do it, but it's kind of like porn. YA is actually also kind of like porn, and bear with me for a minute. It's the famous story of the judge who was making a ruling about whether or not something was pornography, and he said, well, I just know it when I see it. And YA is a lot like that, and YA voice is a lot like that. You know it when you see it. When you're reading a book, it's either gonna feel true to you as teenage voice or it's not, and a YA is either gonna feel like a YA novel or it's not. Which I know doesn't actually help. So some of these hallmarks and rules that I'm telling you will, of course, you're gonna go, ah, okay, I get that. And others, it is a kind of, I know it when I see it, and you'll know it when you see it if you read a lot in the genre. Again, I find a lot of people who are confused about what YA is don't actually read a lot of it, so reading a lot of YA will help a lot. Another defining characteristic of a lot of YA, and I hesitate to say all YA because there are some glorious and fantastic exceptions, but romance tends to be a big deal in YA, and not just romance, but first love. Because so often we experience first love or first crush or sexual feelings, because there is sex in YA, guys. It's not explicit, but it is in a lot of YA. But we experience all those things when we are young adults, when we are teenagers, so that tends to be a common element or theme of young adult fiction. I'd say more recently we've definitely seen stories that don't have a core romantic element. They're friendship stories, and that's actually really refreshing, because I'd say YA, when it was kicking off, when it was really developing as a genre 10 years ago, there were no exceptions to the rules. You had to have romance in your YA, but increasingly it is less and less of a rule. But I will say that the overwhelming majority of YA fiction does tend to have a central core romance and explore the ideas of first love. I do want to share one of my favorite distinctions between middle grade and YA that I have heard. This came from a friend of mine, and she got it from an Andrea Brown workshop, and that is that middle grade is about finding your place with your family and your community, whereas YA is about finding yourself and your place in the world. It's the themes of fitting in versus standing out, and I think that's a really excellent distinction to make, especially if you are wondering, is my book middle grade or is it YA? Think about those themes and the journey that your character is going to go on. That's the whole thing with there are all sorts of different kinds of coming of age stories, and I think the kind of pushing back against conventions and the world that you're in and establishing, kind of your individual identity is a very teenage thing, and so those tend to be dominant themes that you find in YA work. And honestly, this is one of the reasons I think YA has really hit a chord with so many adult readers. And overwhelmingly, it is millennial and Gen X readers, though I know that there are boomers who love YA, but I'd say the huge core of big fan adult YA readers tend to be millennials and Generation X. I am a millennial, I'm an old millennial, and I think that's because as generations, we're constantly pushing against authority and expectation and the world that we inherited. And so I think that's why so many adults relate to themes in YA, which are in many ways universal. All right, so now what isn't YA? As I said, it is not YA if you've got a book and the main character is an adult and they are flashing back on their childhood and they start as a young person, 9, 10, 11, 12. They go through their teenage years and they end up in their 20s or even beyond that. That is not a YA novel. That is just an adult novel. And that's totally okay. If that is what you want to write and that is what you have, you wrote a novel. Great. But it is not a YA novel. So in terms of the market and comps, you're gonna have to read adult novels that have similar literary devices and tacks. One that I can think of is The Goldfinch. It follows a character who starts as a younger person, but that character grows up. It's not a YA. It is a adult literary novel, and that's totally fine. I mentioned The Book Thief and that it is not YA. First of all, the main character is a bit too young for a large part of the book to be YA. She is more middle grade aged, but more importantly, the narrator of the book is death. It is not told from the immediate point of view of a young adult, and there's nothing wrong with that. The Book Thief is an adult literary novel, but the publisher saw great market potential to cross-market it as a YA novel, and it did really, really well for them. And I have absolutely no problem with that, but it's just not a YA novel. So when I get people who are like, oh yeah, like The Book Thief, I'm like, you can totally write a book like The Book Thief, but it's not gonna be a YA novel the way that commercial YA fiction is YA. So that's just an important distinction to know. And that, again, it's because of the narrator and the immediacy that you're getting from the POV, and also kind of the overarching themes of the novel. It's all approached from the perspective of essentially adulthood. Another sticky subgenre that really isn't YA, and again, it's kind of like the porn rule, like you know it when you see it. Anything where the voice is off and it feels like an adult writing about teenagers, anything that's kind of moralizing issues or preachy, that's not YA. What is it? It's just not YA, and it's also not often a good idea, by the way. Teenagers don't like to be talked down to, they don't like to be moralized to, so generally if you have a book that does that, even if you have nailed voice and an immediacy and tone, like, teenagers are gonna see right through that. So that generally is just, as a rule of thumb, not a good idea to do in YA. So there you have it, a very broad, but also deep, and kind of vague and full of exceptions definition of what YA is. I mean, it is definitely books about characters, for sure, 15 to 18-year-olds who are teenagers with an immediacy and emotions and feelings and romance and pushing against authority and growing and all of those things. All of those things are definitely YA. But you know what when you see it, and as I mentioned, the key is if you're really like not sure what you have on your hands if you're writing a book, read more YA. And honestly, if you read a ton of YA and you're pretty sure you wrote a YA novel because you're pretty familiar with YA, you probably wrote a YA novel. You don't have to think too hard about it. But if there's anything I've mentioned and you're like, oh no, I did it that way, you can always consider a revision to make it more YA, but there's also nothing wrong with having a book on your hands that is just a novel, an adult novel, because again, YA is a marketing category. You wrote a book either way. It just cannot be put into the YA marketing category because it doesn't fit the constraints of that marketing category, so you can query it as something else, and that is totally fine. So I hope this helped. As always though, I probably missed something or something wasn't clear, so drop any questions or comments down below. I would be happy to answer them. Sometimes direct questions of what you find confusing unlocks something in my brain and makes it easier for me to explain. Because as I mentioned, I think I've got like YA coursing through my veins that it's like second nature to me. And if you read enough YA and you write enough YA, it'll become second nature to you too. So thank you everyone, and as always, happy writing.